I locked every account you have. You went overseas and came back unhinged, so the families decided to put the house on the market. That was my father's voice, ice cold through the phone, arriving at the exact moment my card got rejected over a $4 coffee. Underneath his words I could hear my little sister snickering in the background. Stop being dramatic and just ask nicely if you need cash. Don't embarrass us. I was a captain in the United States Navy, fresh off a brutal 9-month deployment at sea, and my own blood was quietly stripping me of everything I owned. They'd used a temporary power of attorney to turn me into a personal cash machine, funneling my savings to my sister, who contributed nothing and took everything. But they had badly underestimated who they were dealing with. I didn't waste breath arguing. I hung up, put my uniform back on, and drove straight to the Navy's legal office. 2 hours later my phone was lighting up with dozens of missed calls from my father, all arriving right alongside the sound of federal agents at his front door. Before I get into how my own parents managed to bring the FBI down on themselves, if you're enjoying this, drop a like, subscribe, and tell me where you're tuning in from. Betrayal like this shouldn't be carried alone. I'd just come home from a punishing 9-month deployment wanting nothing but the quiet of the house I'd shared with my late husband, Arthur. 9 months of salt-stiff uniforms, engine fumes, and the endless vibration of the ship under my boots. That house was the last piece of him I had, his cologne still faint on the curtains, his footsteps still somehow in the floorboards. But the peace didn't last. It started at the base cafe, when my card was declined for a plain black coffee. Something in my gut told me this wasn't a glitch, so I drove straight to the credit union. The air in branch manager Marcus Thorne's office felt wrong the second I walked in, too still, smelling of floor cleaner and bad news. Marcus, normally quick with a handshake and a smile, wouldn't meet my eyes. He fumbled with his glasses, pulled up my file, and cleared his throat twice before he could speak. Captain, someone changed your mailing address and account details last week. Your pay and benefits are all being auto-forwarded to your sister Jessica's account. I didn't flinch. I sat perfectly still while the words carved through me. 20 years of hazard pay, combat deployments, and the death benefit that came after Arthur was killed in action, every bit of it now feeding a 32-year-old who called herself an entrepreneur but had never once turned a profit. My jaw locked, but I kept my spine straight. Before I could process the insult of it, a federal agent named Sarah Jenkins walked in, dropped a thick case file on the desk hard enough to rattle the pen cup, and calmly explained that my parents hadn't just redirected my paycheck. 3 days after I deployed, while I was unreachable at sea, they'd filed an emergency guardianship petition with the county, claiming I'd voluntarily handed over control of my estate due to combat trauma and grief after Arthur's death. They'd built a legal case declaring me mentally unfit, using my service and my husband's death as their justification. There was even a letter, supposedly written by me, begging them to take over, a letter I'd never written or seen. I picked it up. The signature was an eerily convincing forgery, good enough to fool a notary. A cold shock ran through me. This wasn't just about the money anymore. They were trying to erase my competency, my rank, my dignity. I forced my breathing into a slow, controlled rhythm, because I knew exactly what they wanted, proof of instability. One outburst and their whole fabricated story would look true. Marcus added quietly that my spending limit had been cut to $500 a month. The pity in his voice made my stomach turn. I'd led sailors through violent storms in the Pacific, made split-second calls with alarms blaring and water crashing over the deck. Now my own parents had legally reduced me to a child on an allowance. They didn't see a decorated officer. They saw a source of funds to keep their favorite child afloat. I refused to cry. I slid the fraudulent document back across the desk, looked the agent dead in the eye, and told her plainly, I never signed this. It's forged. The moment I said it, my grief hardened into something colder and far more useful. My parents were dead to me in every way that mattered. I stood, straightened my collar, and gave a firm nod. The quiet war had begun. That night the house felt hollow. Every wall of it had been paid for with Arthur's life insurance, money that existed because he didn't come home. All I'd gotten was a folded flag and a visit from an admiral at dawn. That money had built this home, and now they wanted to sell it out from under me. I stood by the fireplace, Arthur's reading glasses still on the side table, his flannel shirt still on its hook. I picked up his dog tags and gripped them until the edges cut into my palm. The pain kept me anchored, kept me from spiraling into the fog they wanted for me. Every instinct told me to drive over and confront them, but I remembered my training: don't win small fights, win the war. So the next morning I went straight to Navy Legal Counsel to see Captain Robert Vance. Walking into that building felt more like home than my childhood ever had. I laid out everything for Robert: the forged guardianship, the drained accounts, the counterfeit signature, my sister's smug greed. He didn't offer sympathy. He tapped his pen against the desk and smiled the smile of a man who'd just found an easy case. He told me plainly, don't confront them. Any anger from me would be used as evidence that I was unstable. Let them keep spending, we need the paper trail. If I fought back now, they'd use the fake guardianship to have me committed within 2 days, and a judge might actually believe them. I had to let them think they'd already won. Every dollar they stole was another count against them. He handed me a small recorder and told me to capture everything. I agreed to become exactly what they expected: fragile, quiet, defeated. I'd let them believe they'd broken me while I quietly built the case that would bury them. For 3 weeks I performed the role. My father would sit on my porch drinking my liquor, offering fake concern about how vulnerable I was. My mother brought soup and rifled through my mail while pretending to comfort me. Under the table, my thumb stayed on the record button. I played the part flawlessly, slouched, distracted, scared of my own shadow. One day I asked for $800 to fix my truck. My sister barely looked up from her phone before telling me it was safer if I just stayed home, and that she'd invest the money in her latest venture instead, her 4th failed business that year. My parents praised her vision like she was a prodigy. Underneath the table my fists clenched hard enough to draw blood. 3 days later, Thomas Riley, an old friend of Arthur's, called to tell me my father had been showing realtors around my house, telling them I was moving into a care facility. The floor seemed to drop out from under me. They intended to sell the last physical trace of my husband while I was still standing inside it. I didn't scream. I simply locked every door in the house and began uploading every recording to the secure drive Robert had set up. Playing the broken soldier was wearing on me more than I wanted to admit. I caught my reflection one morning and barely recognized the tired, hollow woman staring back. I drove to the harbor for air that didn't feel poisoned. Retired Admiral Richard Hayes was there, and without asking for details, he told me plainly that the rank on my shoulders didn't allow me to break, not even for an enemy hiding inside my own family. It steadied me instantly. Not long after, Robert sent me an intercepted email from my father to a real estate firm known for fast, no-questions sales. It read, "Move quickly, she doesn't know yet, we'll have it sold before she catches on." The arrogance of it was staggering. He genuinely believed he'd outmaneuvered someone trained to outthink hostile forces at sea. I forwarded it straight to Agent Jenkins and to Robert. It was time to move. Over the following 2 months, everything accelerated. I worked with Eleanor Sterling, a seasoned attorney who'd spent decades dismantling predatory guardianships. Together we quietly locked down every asset my parents hadn't yet discovered: pensions, insurance, savings, sealing them off before the final move. The cost of the deception hit hardest one weekend when my niece, Lily, wandered into my kitchen clutching her teddy bear and asked, in a small trembling voice, why her grandfather said I was crazy and might have to go to a hospital. I knelt down and held her, furious that they were poisoning a child's understanding of me before she was old enough to question it. The next day my mother arrived with a tray of baked goods and a glossy brochure for a private psychiatric facility in the countryside, manicured grounds, smiling staff, and buried deep in the fine print, a 60-day mandatory hold during which my parents, thanks to the forged guardianship, would control everything. It was a trap disguised as a retreat. I thanked her and said I'd think about it, watching her leave already texting my father in triumph. The moment her car was gone, I sat down and wrote in my notebook, "The trap is set." Then I sent out invitations for a family dinner, formal attire requested. They arrived dressed to the nines, clearly expecting a celebration of their victory. What they didn't know was that Robert, Eleanor, Marcus, and Agent Jenkins were also at the table, dressed casually, posing as old military friends. My mother even poured wine for the federal agent sitting beside her, unaware there was a badge under her cardigan. Dinner conversation dripped with their greed, my father eyeing the furniture he planned to auction, my sister checking her phone for the transfer that hadn't come yet. I sat at the head of the table, in Arthur's old seat, in a black dress cut like a dress uniform, hands steady on the wood. When dessert was cleared, my father stood, tapped his glass, and made a speech thanking me for finally accepting that the family should manage everything. The room went silent. I set my water glass down hard enough to make my sister jump, and told him plainly, "You'd be right if this were an actual family. But you're not family. You're thieves." I pulled the case file out from under the table and dropped it in the center, spilling out the forged documents, the transcripts, the emails. Robert, Eleanor, Marcus, and Agent Jenkins all rose together, identifying themselves formally. My father went pale and speechless. My mother grabbed the table to keep from falling. But the real blow hadn't landed yet. Agent Jenkins turned to my sister and dropped a second file into her lap. While everyone had been focused on stealing from me, Jessica had been secretly using my parents' identities too, forging their signatures on credit applications and loans to fund her spending, burying them under debt they never knew existed. The room fell into stunned silence as my parents realized the child they'd sacrificed everything for had betrayed them as thoroughly as she'd betrayed me. My sister knocked her chair over trying to back away, stammering excuses no one believed. I stood and told them plainly, "I'm not unstable. There's no trauma excuse here. You're the ones who committed federal crimes." My father collapsed into his chair. My mother, still clinging to denial, grabbed for my hand and insisted I owed my sister support because I was the older one and had plenty. I pulled away and walked to the cabinet where I kept Arthur's medals, the Purple Heart, the honors he'd earned overseas and never came home from. I set them down hard on the table in front of my father and told him that the house, the assets, everything they'd tried to take, had been paid for with Arthur's life. He broke down completely. I leaned in and asked them quietly why a soldier's memory was worth less to them than my sister's comfort, then turned my back on their tears, which I recognized instantly as grief not for what they'd done, but for getting caught. I gave Agent Jenkins a nod, and she began reading my sister her rights. I walked out without looking back, and for the first time in months I breathed freely. A year passed. With everything Robert and Sarah had gathered, I could have sent all three of them away for a very long time. The prosecutor called it one of the clearest cases of financial exploitation she'd seen in years. But when I thought about Lily and Sam, my sister's children, I couldn't do it. I refused to make them collateral damage in decisions their mother had made. So instead of prison, I chose permanence a different way. Eleanor helped me lock every asset I owned into an irrevocable trust, completely out of my family's reach, with instructions that everything eventually go to veterans' causes and a scholarship fund for military families. I also created a separate, protected education fund for Lily and Sam, accessible only when they turn 18 and completely hidden from their mother. My sister's free ride ended entirely. No more spending my money, no more pretend businesses. She ended up waitressing at a diner just to stay ahead of the debt she created. My parents, meanwhile, spent their retirement working service jobs to cover the very debts she'd secretly run up in their names. Everything they'd built over a lifetime was gone, undone by the same greed they'd indulged for years. One Tuesday morning, back in uniform, medals on my chest, I walked into that same base cafe and ordered the same $4 coffee that had started it all. This time the card went through without a hitch. Just a smile from the cashier and the quiet reassurance of having my life fully back in my own hands. Walking out into the sunlight, I saw him, my father, in a faded janitor's uniform, sweeping the sidewalk across from the base gate. No blazer, no country club, no swagger. Just an old man with a broom, watching me from a distance he clearly understood he couldn't cross. I gave him a single, formal nod, nothing more, and walked on toward the docks, leaving him behind for good. Family isn't a license to exploit someone. Real love doesn't ask you to disappear so someone else can be comfortable. If you believe that sometimes protecting yourself means walking away and letting people face what they built, like and subscribe, and share your own story in the comments, carrying that kind of weight alone is harder than anyone admits.